And I'm very glad to be here today. I'm basically an Africanist, although, as we spoke before, I do not define myself only as an Africanist, because colonialism is my subject, and colonialism was actually done by Europe, so it is part of European history as well. On the 15th of August 2004, the French government organized a special ceremony to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Allied landing in Provence. Usually in recent years before that, more emphasis was given to the landing in Normandy, which is considered more central and important. But that specific year, there was some disagreement with the US government in France, and it was decided to pay more attention to Provence, because in Provence, the Americans did not participate in such a significant way. But the soldiers who did participate in a very significant way in the landing in Provence were actually colonial soldiers. If we talk about numbers, there were 500,000 soldiers who participated in the landing, out of which 120,000 were from the colonial army, colonial units, mainly from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, which is a very large percentage. In this speech, the then president of France, Jacques Chirac, paid special homage to the African soldiers who participated in the battles. Standing on the dais, Chirac addressed the African political leaders in the audience in these words: "The sons of your nations had associated their names to France's military legend. They had forever mixed their blood with ours." The 2004 ceremony marked the end of a long period of oblivion with regard to African sacrifices for France during the two world wars. Since then, a large number of ceremonies and memorials, publications, exhibitions, and art projects in France attempted to tell the story of the African colonial soldiers known as the tirailleurs sénégalais. In this presentation, I would like to discuss several examples of cultural products aiming to commemorate African soldiers to demonstrate the relation between this renewed commemoration and the political struggles of African immigrants in France. By the way, when I say African, I mean North African and Sub-Saharan African, although of course there are two different groups, but I use the geographical term of Africa. I will therefore not only discuss what the French and Africans living in France attempt to remember, but also what they attempt to forget. I will first offer some historical background with regard to the service of Africans in the French army during the colonial period. Then I will move to examine the reasons for their forgetting up until the recent decade, and for the awakening of the remembrance in the beginning of this century. Next, I will examine three cultural products, two of which were created by immigrants living in France that aim to commemorate African soldiers: a book for young adults, a comic book series, and a film. Finally, I will consider the unspoken parts of the story of the African soldiers and explain the motives for these silences, both for the French government and for African immigrants. So, about the colonial soldiers. France began recruiting African soldiers to its army as early as 1857. The reason for this recruitment was actually to colonize the French Empire. The use of European soldiers or French soldiers was considered too expensive. Also, Europeans tended to die of disease on the African continent. And of course, there was the problem of the public opinion. French colonialism at its beginning, eventually even later, was not such a popular project in France. There was a lot of objection to this idea of colonizing other countries. And the idea was that if European soldiers or French soldiers would die in great numbers conquering colonies, there would be a major opposition to colonialism, to the colonial project in Europe, while if Africans die, of course, no one will care so much. Basically, the idea was to use these soldiers to conquer new colonies and then to maintain the order in these colonies. But in the beginning of the 20th century, when the clouds of war began to darken the European skies, a colonel, later to become general by the name of Charles Mangin, had a brilliant idea. he actually said that it would be a great idea to use African soldiers in France, on French soil, to defend France from its enemies, because of course, the falling birth rate in France and the problem of not having enough manpower. Based on the pseudo-scientific racial theories of his time, Manjan claimed that several so-called natural attributes of the Africans made them excellent soldiers. Their ability to live in harsh climates, their capacity to carry heavy loads over great distances, related to the fact that many of them were former slaves, and the supposedly underdeveloped nervous system that allowed them to withstand pain. He argued that those ostensible qualities made African soldiers valuable for deployment as what he called troupes de choc. It can be translated in English to shock troops or something like that. And that their appearance on the battlefields of Europe would have a considerable effect on enemies' morale. Although there were some objections to Manjan's proposal, mainly because of the idea of having black soldiers defending white civilians, which wasn't considered such a great idea, in World War I, when the situation in 1916 began to be quite difficult, the idea was actually implemented. And a large number of African soldiers were recruited to fight in the trenches. Later in World War II, this was resumed, and also around 100,000 African soldiers were recruited to fight in France up until the armistice of June 1940. After World War II, African soldiers continued to serve in the army. That was a very, very different type of service. I won't come into that. This is actually my new project, my recent project, but this was not exactly the same story. Africans were, at this period, the French army actually changed the nature of the colonial army. There was a question of pensions of African soldiers' pensions and those of the French veterans. And Africans actually mostly volunteered to fight in the French army. They took part in the repression, the very brutal repression of the revolt in Madagascar in 1947, and in the Indochina War, and later in the Algerian War. Now, before I discuss the renewed remembrance of the tirailleurs in France, I would like to try and explain the preceding long years of silence. The tirailleurs were a significant colonial symbol. During the interwar years, they represented for many French people the ultimate proof of the utility of the empire. French colonial militaries saw in their loyalty and willingness to sacrifice their lives for France a living, or in many cases dying, proof of the success of French colonial methods and their superiority over those of the rival colonial powers, mainly Britain. Therefore, reminding the French public of the heroism of the tirailleurs in World War I served as a way of convincing them of the utility of the empire and demonstrating to them the successes of French colonialism. You can see here, for example, one of the main memorials built in the city of Reims in 1924, commemorating African soldiers who fought in World War I. It's called Les Héros de l'Armée Noire, the heroes of the Black Army. This monument was actually demolished by the Nazis after they entered Reims. And only recently, which shows you how much this subject is awakening in France, in 2020, there was this reconstruction of the monument. You see it's kind of modern now. Although what is really surprising that it's really difficult to see, but what is really conspicuous in this monument is the kind of paternalistic gesture of the French soldier, which kind of it's obvious who is the commander here. That the French soldier is above the African soldiers, and this wasn't changed so much. This sculpture actually changed the style, made it into a modern style, but didn't really change the concept itself.
Where is it located?
It's near a cathedral of Reims, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it's outside. Yeah. Now, the commemoration of the African soldiers and the discussion of the sacrifices of the soldiers who fought in World War II was also important for the French, but mainly for the army. After World War II, this is a period in which colonialism is under severe international criticism, and the only ones who still insist on commemorating African soldiers is actually military commanders who wish to express their idea of a benevolent colonialism after World War II that should actually continue and not well, they were against independence. There were some commemoration of African soldiers also after World War II. One of the main sites of commemoration is this cemetery near near a village called Chasselet-Montlusan near Lyon. You can see here, if you see, no, there's not. If you can see this tower, the tower is actually an imitation of the Sahelian architecture of Mali, Djenné, Timbuktu, all those places. And the soldiers who are buried here were actually those who protected the road to Lyon against the German. And when they were captured by the German in 1940, the Germans actually instructed them to go to, they told them they were free and then shot them all. The cemetery itself, it's a very interesting story. I don't have time to get into it, but it was actually constructed under the Vichy regime. And it was the initiative of the villagers, of the French villagers from this area who actually really wished to express their recognition to these African soldiers who had protected them. But after World War, after the period of decolonization and independence of the African countries, there was actually a forgetting of this contribution of African soldiers to the two world wars. And this was a part of a more general forgetting of the entire colonial past. This oblivion was reflected in the change of colonial names of certain institutions. For example, the Jardin Colonial became the Jardin Tropical, and in the marginalization of the colonial past in school, textbook, and academic research. The main explanation for this almost total erasure is the violent and highly controversial character of the decolonization process in large parts of the French Empire, notably the Algerian War, but also in Indochina and Madagascar. The French did not want to remember the colonial past, and so they preferred to forget the tirailleurs who represented for them one of its more vivid symbols. What then put an end to this so-called happy forgetting during the last decade? Two major processes forced the French to begin discussing the colonial past. First, this past was not exactly in the past. France's continuing relations with its ex-colonies during the last decades can often be described as neo-colonial. Debates around French policies in Africa evoked the repressed memory of the colonial past. A second process that is more related to our topic here, that contributed to this awakening of colonial memory is the massive immigration to France from its ex-colonies and the social and cultural dilemmas this immigration created. Just as African veterans twisted and used the French idea of the blood debt, this was a term, the blood debt was a term actually that was invented by military commanders, especially by Mangeon and others. What they actually said was that the Africans have to serve France because they should be grateful for the fact that France had saved them from their bloodthirsty leaders and gave them civilization instead of barbarism. And therefore they should be thankful and they should fight for France and to protect it. Now what happened after World War II, the African veterans take this expression, the blood debt, and give it an opposite interpretation. They're saying, we fought for France, we gave our blood for France, now we deserve equality. Now, this idea of blood debt is something that immigrants in France also decided to adopt. And actually demanded equal rights based on the fact that their forefathers, although of course it's not always their own forefathers, fought for France. But even if the tirailleurs and colonialism in general were now being remembered, the question was still how the colonial past should be remembered. At the background of this awakened remembrance stood a law published in 23rd February 2005. One of the law's most controversial clauses sought to impose upon researchers and teachers its vision of the colonial past as positive, expressing the government's desire, and I quote, that school curricula recognize in particular the positive role of France's overseas presence. This clause was officially struck down in January 2006 by France's Constitutional Council, but other clauses of the same law remained intact. Obviously, this legislative attempt to turn the happy forgetting of France's colonial past into a happy remembrance created great commotion in the academic circles, as well as in other spheres, and opened a debate about the heritage of French colonialism. The ways in which African colonial soldiers should be remembered was an essential part of this debate. I will now examine two publications and a film which discuss African colonial soldiers. The publications are designated for two groups of youth: the children of immigrants, for whom the remembrance of the tirailleurs is a reinforcement of their own sense of importance and belonging in a society that generally tends to marginalize them and even reject them, and French youth, who are totally unaware of the contribution of these soldiers to the liberty of their country. In the case of the second group, the aim of these publications is to persuade the next generation of French men and women that the immigrants living among them are not total strangers, but in fact share their history, its miseries, and its glories. So the first publication I would like to discuss is this book. Its cover is horrible. It's really horrible. I don't know why it was chosen, because the content of the book is not, this guy with first of all, the soldier with the mouth and the machete, which is actually this kind of a symbol of barbarism, which is something, if I can guess right, the author did not pick this photo, but this cover, but maybe the publisher did, but I don't know. That's only my guess. If he did, it's really a very strange choice. Now, this is a book for adolescents, written by a French author. See his name. Yves Pinguili. The book called Verdun, Verdun 1916, 1916, Un tirailleur en enfer, meaning tirailleur in hell. And it was published in a series called Le Roman de la Mémoire, and it was a co-publication of the Nathan Press and the French Ministry of Defense. So you can see, of course, who is responsible for this book. The plot presents the main character quite differently than the image of it on its cover. Tierno Diallo did not intend to go and risk his life for France. He did not wish to join the army at all. In fact, he arrived to the battlefields of World War I by mistake, due to a cruel trick of another African soldier who found him and his friend too clever. Throughout Diallo's harsh experiences in the war, it is quite obvious that he is not at all sure why he has to go through all these agonies. The purpose of the war is not clear to him or to his comrades, Africans and French. The best illustration of this is a poignant sentence of the narrator following the death of one of the other African soldiers. And I quote, "They were all convinced, although they did not say so. The dead, all the dead, have many questions to ask." Nevertheless, this criticism is not directed specifically at the recruitment of Africans to fight a war that was not theirs, but is rather a part of the general view of World War I as a redundant war. The last paragraph of the book's epilogue adds more heroic tone to the story by mentioning Diallo's descendants who know very little about his exploits in World War I, in which, according to this text, he liberated France with his black and white comrades over there in Verdun. Another representation of the tirailleurs is a new series. Well, it's not that new. It's kind of like 10 years ago. A series of cartoon strips entitled La Patrouille de Caporal Samba. The patrouille is like a military unit of Corporal Samba. The author, I'll show you this is one of the images from the comics. The author, Fayez Samb, the hero of the series is named after him, Samba, is a descendant of a tirailleur from Senegal and a French woman. The first booklet in this series, Le Tirailleur Sénégalais à Lyon, tells the story the same story I told you with when I showed you the picture, the photo of the cemetery in Lyon, of the massacre of African soldiers by the Germans after they had been captured in June 1940. This booklet focuses on World War II and tells the story of the German cruelty. The tirailleurs are presented as loyal to France, as heroes, but at the same time anti-heroes. They keep complaining about having to march long distances. In one of the scenes, a hint of another voice is heard when one of the recruits asks why they should fight, why they should go and fight for France. The explanation he receives is twofold. First, the French might decide to bestow freedom on their colonies in return for African participation in the war. Second, the soldiers will be the first to see Paris. There is no mention, however, that, of the fact that the French did not rush to give, to give that freedom in the end of the war, and that most of the tirailleurs did not see Paris at all during the war, and not even when it was over. In fact, Charles de Gaulle ordered the French army be whitened before the victorious troops entered Paris in August 1944. The only sin of France referred to in these stories is that it had forgotten the sacrifices of the tirailleurs, and even that accusation is not directed in France in a blatant way. Just like Pinguilly's book, The Adventures of Caporal Samba and his troops combine the story of the tirailleurs with the general French story of the two world wars. The African soldiers are part of the national tragedies that this war brought upon the French nation. An excellent example for this is an image of the tirailleur. You can see here marked in red. The image of a tirailleur lying on the ground next to his rifle, accompanied by the famous and moving line from Arthur Rimbaud's poem, Le Dormeur du Val. And I quote it in, I'll translate it in English. He sleeps in the sun, his hand on his chest, tranquil. He has two red holes on his right side. Now, of course, the use of this sentence actually puts this tirailleur into French culture and French history. A third and rather different example of cultural products aiming to tell the story of African colonial soldiers to the French public is Rachid Boucharab's 2006 film Indigène, translated weirdly into English as Days of Glory, probably to attract more audience. I don't know if you have seen this movie. It's those who've seen it, it's kind of a French colonial version of Saving Private Ryan, I suppose. The idea at the end is that they all stay alone, these four soldiers, and have to actually save the day by themselves. The main difference between this film and the two formally discussed publications is that Boucharab criticizes France's attitude to the African immigrants and presents it as an ingratitude to their forefathers' sacrifices for France. Boucharab, born in France to North African immigrants, proclaimed on many occasions that he felt very French. His aim in the film was, and I quote, to tell this little-known chapter of French history because we are part of it. The film tells the story of 4 Moroccan soldiers who fought in World War II, all but one of whom were killed in a bloody battle in an Alsatian village in 1945. In the last scene, 60 years later, the sole survivor is seen returning to his tiny apartment in a shabby suburb of Paris from a visit to the cemetery where his Moroccan and French comrades are buried. This scene juxtaposes the soldiers' heroic past with the miserable living condition of immigrants in France today. And indeed, even before Boucharab's influential films, the commemoration of African soldiers was linked in the French public discourse to the immigrants living in France today. The most illustrative example for that is a caricature published in Le Monde following the immigrants' riots of October 2005, during which the protesters' anger was mainly expressed in the torching of cars. And this is the caricature. You can see here this monument, this tirailleur standing on the monument with the flag of the World War I, and he says, "Oh, I remember we used to burn cars or torch cars." And you can see on the ground, of course, the vehicles, the German with the German cross, the vehicles that soldiers actually torched in the past, which was, of course, positive. In contrast to the vehicles that they torch today. But of course, this kind of cynical caricature shows that this actually also expresses this ingratitude of French society towards Africans who in the past fought against France's enemies. The massive immigrant population living within France and the debate over the place of Islam within French society were understood in this caricature in the context of African participations in 2 world wars. Indeed, the call to remember African colonial soldiers' sacrifice was linked to the demand for immigrants' equal rights in France today. Immigrants thus reminded France of the colonial past and exploited it for their aims, invoking the French coined concept of blood debt to their own benefit. The few examples I brought here emphasize well the continuation of forgetting that is entailed in the recent burst of remembrance of the tirailleurs in France. While those who have fought in the 2 world wars are remembered, all the rest, meaning those who participated in the colonization of Africa before World War I and those who helped repressing anti-colonial revolts after World War II, are continued to be forgotten. The focus only on those who fought for France contributes to a smoother remembrance and avoids dealing with difficult issues regarding the roles of soldiers as the accessories of French colonial rule. It also restructures the history of the tirailleurs as an integral part of the history of metropolitan France. The focus on the 2 world wars and the soldiers' presentations as heroes rather than as victims of colonialism or as traitors to their own peoples create a past shared by colonizers and colonized. Such a shared past is essential for the demands of African immigrants to belong to the French nation on the one hand and presents this France's colonial past as one of brotherhood and equality rather than oppression and racism. In his book Oblivion, Marc Auguet speaks about forgetting as an essential part in the process of remembrance. In fact, he emphasizes sometimes it is necessary to forget the past in order to live the present and look forward to the future. Something we don't really know how to do, but that's another question. As much as we think of forgetting as negative, no one is interested to resemble that character in Borges' story who could not forget anything and therefore had no time to live. Seen in this way, forgetting can be positive and constructive, especially forgetting in which many of the concerned parties are interested. Nevertheless, while this forgetting may be convenient for the ex-colonizers as well as for Africans living in France today, it might be dangerous for the representation of French colonialism, especially now after the legislative attempt to enforce a positive view in the study of French colonialism in schools and universities. Such a distorted and selective remembrance of the past might encourage forgetting what colonialism was actually about. Thank you.
I have 3 very little comments to Ruth, and the first one actually is linked to the 2 presentation. You might have noticed that the change towards the immigrants, be it in being in Germany or towards the way African soldiers could be integrated into the French army, is related to the birth rate in the countries. Birth rate in France at the time, or birth rate in Germany now. So that's an interesting point, which something I found interesting. The second comment, very, very short, relates to the way the German propaganda used the participation of the black soldiers in the French army. And we have an example in the very famous movie, The Sorrow and the Pity, where we show a piece of this propaganda when showing this is what civilization is. And this civilization, they show black soldiers in all kinds of really ridiculous ways of behaving, the way they did with Jews actually, and this is how they are fighting barbarism being represented by, you know, the Germans marching in order, etc. But that it has been very much used by the German propaganda against France. And the third one is even shorter. It's about the French Ministry of Defense as a publisher. I'm not sure you can draw something out of that, because they are very they just financed my book on Drancy.
No, I don't think so. And also the book is
No, what I mean is the French Ministry of Defense has a very, very large financing policy in history. They are very, very active in that. So I'm not sure you can use that. Okay, now I won't use anymore the privilege of chairing the panel. And please, do you have questions?
I noticed some parallels. Maybe it's because I'm from America, and you left out America, between the use of African slaves to fight in World War I and II, and the fact that it took a great deal from the White House, namely Eleanor Roosevelt, to even allow them to be able to fight, to try to get some more freedom from the oppression that they were experiencing in America, and they still haven't gotten it after 4 wars. First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, and I speak as a Vietnam vet because right now there's still that same problem of white supremacy being exercised by both Europe, Israel, and America. And I don't see, in Australia, of course, New Zealand, of course, and I don't see that being attacked or looked at as a problem that's at the core of why Africans are so disrespected today as immigrants.
So let me add 2 questions, one to each of you. Catherine, I was wondering if those in the figures you presented, those who acquired German citizenship, does this figure include immigrants with a German background from Poland, for instance? Or is it a specific category? How does it fit in the general picture? And Ruth, I would ask about the question related to the shift of memory, and in which way could it be linked to a shift in focus from the France during World War II, which has been so central in French memory during so many years, but now it's not anymore the focus, because I think so much has been said, so much has been researched, so much has been commemorated, that it's not that much as a focus. So there is space, and because it was a success, it's a success in the way that it had become central in French memory, in which way it's a kind of inspiration from other groups to try and find and fight for their own space in this memory ground, field ground. We might maybe do the opposite now. Ruth will begin to answer, and then Katerina.
Didn't really ask a question, but I will refer to this. What you said about. Sorry, what you said about America and. What, it doesn't work?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
You have to go to the podium, sorry.
Oh, really? Okay. So why is it
This is for the recording.
Okay. All right. So, oh yeah, that's better. What you said about American soldiers is actually very interesting. But if you had like an hour now, I could elaborate on it. But it's really fascinating because I worked a bit about. The Pan-African Congress after World War I, where there was this discussion regarding the same part, the part of Africans in World War I and the parts of African Americans in World War I, and the boys actually worked with Diane from Senegal on actually turning this participation of African Americans in the war into cause to demand equality. But the same Du Bois, just before World War II, actually wrote an article in The Crisis saying to African Americans, do not go to the war, because this was a failure. It didn't work. We sacrificed ourselves for the United States, but they still didn't give us any rights. And actually, in France, maybe because it's really different. It's a different situation. It's a colonial situation. It's not Africans at the time. It was not Africans living in France. But the African soldiers did manage to turn their service into a way to acquire equality, which they did during the period of decolonization and lost it only during independence. So it's not that it never works, but you're definitely right about American history, and this is really amazing how this participation and sacrifices of African Americans was not recognized in a very late stage, you say even until today, by the United States. What should I continue?
My question was more directed toward the need to attack white supremacy as a principle and cultural artifact.
Okay, instead of saying
all the way from Alexander the Great through European history.
Instead of what do you mean?
This
is better instead of yeah, well, of course, but that's
that concept, that principle, has never been attacked.
Well, it was an attempt to attack it, because it was, all this discourse about the same blood, that blood doesn't have any color and we're all equals in front of German bullets. That was actually what you say, but of course in a very limited way. I agree.
And that was after it was turned around.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so and for your question, which I already managed to.
Shift of memory concerning World War II.
Oh yeah. Well, this is quite complex, because there is this shift of memory, and there is a beginning of discussion of the decolonization process, and especially the Algerian War. It's actually okay. We finished with the problem of Vichy France, and now we have another problem to tackle, which we didn't until now. It's the Algerian War. But the thing is that what I'm actually trying to show, that this, because for the African immigrants in France, the way they want to commemorate these African soldiers is to feel themselves more French. They actually have to limit themselves in this commemoration process, and therefore they do not actually try to challenge this idea of, okay, we all fought together in World War II, but what happened in the Algerian War? They used African soldiers to torture FLN members. And this is something they don't want to talk about, because this turns them into quite kind of, people who worked for the colonialism, and of course it raises all this. It's not a reason to show, yeah, we are part of France. We also tortured FLN members. It doesn't, you can say that, but it's not really something that you want to say. So yes, we have this new shift of memory to the Algerian War, and of course there's also the Pied Noir, who has their own sets of memories, quite different memories from the Algerian Wars. But I don't think that this is related specifically to that. I think it's more related to something that was convenient both for these African immigrants and for the French government. I actually have a colleague of mine who works also on African colonial soldiers, and he told me that he was in this exhibition in Fréjus. Fréjus was a very important city for, they had a lot of African soldiers based there because they didn't like the winter so much, or they weren't used to the winter so much. So during the winter months, they were brought to Fréjus, which is on the French Riviera. And there was this exhibition there in their memory, and there was one African immigrant, a woman, who told him, my colleague, that ever since all this commemoration started, it's the first time she feels really French, and she feels really a part of this country. And he said to me later, you hear that and you're so moved by it. You say, wow, this is great. But you know that it's also a lie. It is also a way of distorting the colonial past. So, maybe it's not important for people. Maybe it's only important for us historians. But that is something that is very interesting in this topic.